Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I am Cody Goodwin. I am here with Alex Scarborough. We're going to discuss the last few months when it comes to Alabama football. July's kind of a funny month in that it's like not the official start of the next college football season, but it kind of is the official start of the next college football season. Like we're a week away from SEC Media Days in Dallas, which for our purposes, more or less the unofficial beginning to the next college football season. So we've got this week to kind of get us to that point. And then, after that, we've got a week until fall camp begins. And then that's really when the season coverage really starts to kick off. So I figured before we get to that point, we could start this week with a show that kind of looks back at Alabama's offseason. Here was kind of my idea, Alex. Alabama lost to Michigan in the Rose Bowl on January 1st. And a lot has happened since then, right? There's a new coach in Tuscaloosa. There's been a lot of recruiting wins along the way. There's been a whole new spring season without Nick Saban. Just a lot of little and big things that I figured we could touch on to kind of recap the last few months to really set the stage for what the next month I think is going to bring us. That's our rough plan. Before we get to all of that, though, how are you doing? How was your 4th of July holiday? Are you ready for the madness that July is going to bring us?
I'm doing well, and no, I'm never ready for it. You get these countdowns on Twitter or X, whatever we call it now, and it's just like, how did we get to this place where we're already like less than 2 months away from the season? Depending on what week you're looking at, it's crazy. We're a month away from camp opening, and it just creeps up on you in a hurry. And you're right, we're getting ready for travel to go to Dallas for SEC Media Days, and it really is the beginning of the end of the off season and turning the page toward a new season. But the holiday was good. With a 15-month-old at home, it's always a little bit of work the whole time, but we had a good time. I hope you did too.
It was good. My family, my parents live on a small lake in Kansas City. So I was back in Kansas City for that holiday. So our family's weird. It's usually my fault, but we don't always have time to get together around like the actual holidays. So we do a June miss or a July miss instead of a Christmas. So we were able to kind of package that together with, my bigger family. So we celebrated Christmas on the water a couple of days after celebrating the 4th of July. So it was nice to like get home, get away, see some people. But I tell you what, man, like I don't know about you. I'm ready for some football just because I feel like the last few months, and we'll get into this on today's show, a lot of talking season, and we still have like a few more weeks of talking season. And I just want to watch these guys play ball. I don't know about you, but like that's kind of where I'm at.
100%. And we'll get into like talking about position rankings later. And it really struck me, and like I can talk myself in and out of every scenario because there's no data yet. There's no, and on top of no data, there's a whole new scheme and new coaching staff on top of it. There's just so much that we don't know. A lot of positivity around the program, not to say that, but like just ready for results, ready to get into things we can see and judge with our own eyes.
I was one of those that got suckered into countdown season. So as of today, we're recording this on July 9th, 53 days until week 1. Like we're that close. We're that close. Before we move forward, just kind of give you guys a little bit of programming note. We're going to attempt, at least this is what I have tentatively planned, 2 podcasts a week coming up through this month and through the bulk of, fall camp for Alabama. Going to try and do our best to get into a rhythm that way so that when the season arrives, our goal is actually to bring you guys 3 shows a week. We'll see if that actually comes to fruition, but that's the goal that I have in mind. But I wanted to start this show before we move forward, really looking back, right? Like Alabama lost in the Rose Bowl on January 1st. That seems like a lifetime ago because it kind of was, right? There's been so many different things that have happened since then. And I figured now it would just be kind of a good time to like look back. What do we remember? Some of the bigger inflection points, I think, just in the peaceful transfer of power, so to speak, for Alabama, not to get too political on you guys. But there's a lot has happened, right? Nick Saban is no longer in the building. Kalen DeBoer is now in the building. He's making the program his own. He's got his new staff in here. He has been collecting recruiting wins, it seems like, every month that he has been in Tuscaloosa. But let's go back and start after the Rose Bowl. That was January 1st. Literally 9 days later is when Alabama shook up the college football world. Nick Saban announced his retirement. I believe he announced it through Chris Lowe from ESPN. But then he ultimately came out near the end of the day. Saban in Alabama specifically released statements. He, after 17 years, after 6 national championships, after 9 SEC championships, decided that he was done at the age of 72. I remember where I was that day. I remember what I was about to do that day. I had my pre-workout poured. I was getting ready to drink it and go to the gym. And then we all saw that tweet and we were just like, well, this is what I'm doing today. What do you remember, Alex, about January 10th, about Saban's announcement? What do you remember doing in the hours following that? I'm sure, at that point in time, you're still with ESPN. So what you did and what you probably remember is probably a little bit different from us.
Yeah, it was a weird I was in a transition sort of period where, not to go too inside baseball, I basically told them, look, I'll get you guys through the season. If there's something big and you need me after that, I only had a couple months left on my deal. So primarily what I was doing was taking care of my son, who at that point was 11 months old. And I get an email, because I'm still on work email, from Chris saying this is happening. It literally just no pretext. It's just this is happening, and it's like holy bleep, he's actually going to do it. Like this is real. And if you know Chris, you know that he does not get these things wrong. He agonizes over them, and I have always appreciated that about him. So the weird, like, it's happening. What do I do with my hands? Like, what does this mean? It's strange to think it was only 7 months, 6 months ago, and yet, the earth shook, and the greatest coach of all time retired, and it's still amazing to me that so few people saw it coming. A lot of people will say in hindsight they saw it coming. When I talk to people on staff, the fact that they did not see it coming, that's how I know that all that other stuff is maybe reading between the lines and seeing things that were not there. That's something that momentous could happen the same day he was interviewing candidates for jobs and recruiting. It's so perfectly Nick Saban too, right? Like that's how I look back on it. Like he's so compartmentalizing, and his brain works in such a unique way that he could just put his head down until the last minute and decide, nope, I'm done. And if you're going to go out like that. Don't do the farewell tour for a year. I kind of respect his decision looking back, even though it threw us all for a loop.
I remember at the time, like the story that he told, not to say that this is like incorrect or there's details missing, was that like, he had like two note cards in his hand and he's getting ready to go into a team meeting. And it's like, all right, do I give the one that kind of kicks off the off season, the speech, or do I give the speech that says I'm done? And that's like a fun visual to have, like regarding Saban. And, like Chris Lowe came out with a handful of different stories afterwards. And we did our own reporting here, just trying to piece together the why of the thing. How did he come to this decision? Honestly, it probably took me a week to just be like, he's 72. He's widely regarded as the greatest of all time. This past season, right? Lost to Texas in week 2, came all the way back and ultimately won an SEC championship, got to the college football playoff, maybe perhaps one of his best coaching jobs, which is kind of funny to say about a program that had the most talented like roster top to bottom in college football, arguably. Like he just, I don't know that he had anything more to prove. He had gotten old. He was always very good about seeing where college football was headed, and the combination of the transfer portal and NIL and just all these other factors that kind of built into it. He just got tired, and I don't blame him for that. Like like what more did he have to do? Like, did he have to navigate another era of college football? Like, he clearly felt like he didn't have to. And, like I remember telling this to a lot of like other radio people and even like friends and family that would ask about it, just like, what happened? It's like, well, he got tired. He didn't really want to probably do this anymore, at least in the capacity that he was doing it. He is such a control freak that he needs his hands and his fingerprints on literally everything. And that, because of what college football had become, just wore him out a little bit. So, I don't necessarily blame him. And then after all, I think all the shock wore off. I think a lot of Alabama fans and people in and around college football really kind of quickly understood, like, yeah, like I get it. Like this is, it's a young man's game now a little bit, because you look at all the other head coaches that have been super successful over the last 3, 4, 5 years. A lot of young dudes, a lot of dudes that just operate a slightly different from Saban, which is funny because one of those young dudes is Kirby Smart, right? And some of these other guys that are on the come up, right? Sarkisian, Dan Lanning, a lot of these guys have been under Saban's purview for a little bit too. So, like I kind of shrugged. I was like, hey man, like I get it. Like covering college football can be exhausting sometimes. I can't imagine what it's like being a head coach of, not just a head college football coach, but the head coach of Alabama. Like that is I get it. I'd get tired too. I get tired thinking about it.
Yeah, I don't think it was like a straw that broke the camel's back. I know people want to say NIL and transfer portal. Well, that stuff's been going on for a few years now. And if he didn't like it then, he would have just walked away then. And I think it speaks to I think the best quality Nick Saban had was his ability to see what was happening and adapt to it quickly. He'd complain sometimes and say, like the hurry up no huddle. Is this what we want football to be? Well, then he'd go, okay, I'll go create the best offense in college football, and you
Yeah.
can deal with it. So he did that with NIL. He did that with the transfer portal, where he was able to keep up. But I think he sensed his age, and I respect the fact that he did not want to ride the program down. Now, what would that have looked like? I don't think it would have been a precipitous fall. I think they would have still maintained their spot in the top tier of college football for 2, 3, 4 more years. But if he sensed that he wasn't willing to put in the maximum effort, and that was the only way he ever knew how to do it. Like even going back to when he was a kid, I remember reporting a story when in his high school career and winning a state championship. That's who he's been his whole life. So to decide and know within himself, like I'm 95%, it's not enough. Like who among us would have the willpower and strength to be like $11 million a year, everything that goes with being the Alabama head football coach? Nah, I'm walking away. It'd be very curious to see how he navigates this new phase of life. I think it's going to be one of the more interesting parallel lines of this college football season covering Alabama because he has football, but it's not within a team, and he's been that for 60 years. If you go back to him playing, high school and pee wee and all that stuff, it'll be interesting to see how he handles that. But I have a feeling he'll do really well on television.
I agree. I also just like I really want him to show up at SEC media days and stand in the back of the room and raise his hand during the primary press conferences and just Nick Saban, ESPN, hey coach, let me, ask you a question. Like, welcome to the other side, bro. Like let's see how you can really hack it.
Make sure you wear your credential to get into spots you're supposed to. Eat the terrible media food. Do all of those obligatory things to be just part of the crowd. Like I think I noted it on Twitter or a column or whatever. Like being at A-Day and seeing him walk through the press box while a game was going on was one of the weirdest things I've ever done. And this will be my 13th year covering Alabama. Covered SEC before, but Alabama as well. That was strange, and I think it'll be weird to see him on the other side of the rope.
Now I'm just picturing like SEC officials not letting Nick Saban into certain parts of like SEC media day, even though he's got his like credential on and like, duh, it's Nick Saban. But like, sorry, coach, you don't have access.
It's where you flex and be my face is my credential.
2 days after Saban retired, Kalen DeBoer was hired after leading Washington to the national championship game this past year, Pac-12 championship, both regular season and Pac-12 championship game, 25-3, 2-year record at Washington. This was a 49-hour process. It wasn't actually a 49-hour process. The more we talked to Greg Byrne, the more it's like, okay, like he had told us and others that, I had a short list of coaches that I would call in the off chance that something like this would happen. So there was a little bit of preparation there. The DeBoer hire, I thought was interesting in the moment. And the more you kind of take the step back and you look at, who DeBoer is, what his track record is, what he's very good at. And then also, you combine that with like, okay, where's college football headed? How do you differentiate yourself? This hire made, I thought, a lot of sense. And now the more that we've gotten to know DeBoer since that day, you especially, right? You've done a handful of different sit-down interviews with him, a lot of great stories and reporting on him. You never want to be the guy that follows the guy. But if you are going to be that guy, you would want a guy that more or less operates like Kalen DeBoer, right? Like, what did you think of the quick hiring process? And just, do you remember any of your initial thoughts, Alex, on just like, oh, this is the dude. He's the one that's going to follow Saban, huh?
I remember the feeling of not quite deja vu, but I remember one of the things I was working on at ESPN is again to go a peek behind the curtain. When they lose to Texas, and the sky is falling, one of the first things I thought about is, well, what if Nick does retire? I didn't have any knowledge that this was going to happen, but I talked to an agent who I know, and I said, what do you think about this? And the pause on the other end of the line, it might have only been 30 seconds. It felt like half an hour because it was like, holy, I don't know. Like, it was, I don't know. We had decades to think about this. And it was stepping into that unknown void. And it was two things, I think. One, kind of, you don't believe Nick is going to step away. Not a, you think something happens and then he steps away. That wasn't the case. And two, there was no slam dunk hire. Like, a lot of times, like, oh, go get his, protege who's over here. Well, the problem with the protege who was over here was one of them was at Texas, not going to leave there. Other one's at Georgia, that's his alma mater. He's not going to leave there. There was no slam dunk hire. So it really put Greg Byrne in a weird position to where this agent said, I wouldn't want to be Greg Byrne. I wouldn't want to touch that. But I think Greg made the most of the opportunity and really went with the guy who I do think, look, we don't know what's going to happen, wins and losses. Sports are a weird thing. But the resume, and to your point, the mental makeup that Kalen has is almost perfectly suited for this because he's not a flashy guy. He's not a guy who craves uh, the accolades, who is going to be insecure in Nick Saban's shadow. He's a guy who's been doing this long enough that he's confident in what he's doing, but he's also has the humility to understand that there are other ways to do it as well. And on top of that, as we've talked about in previous podcasts, he's been through versions of this before. Bob Young at Sioux Falls, his mentor follows him up at Fresno State, a weird situation where Jeff Tedford steps away for medical reasons and recommends Kalen, so he's still around. And then at Washington, Chris Peterson, still a constant presence. He's been through this. And then you talk to people in the building, around the building, alumni who are part of the program under Nick Saban, and they all say the same thing. Like, this has been smooth. Like, it's weird how smooth this would be. Because this should be a Ray Perkins, what are you doing tearing down, Bears Tower thing. Like, everything should be hyper analyzed. And why is he doing this? This is Nick's way. None of that's happening. And I think that's, a little bit more understanding on our part, but also a little bit goes toward what Kalen's about as a person and as a coach.
Yeah, there's a very impressive element about this. There could have been a lot of pushback from a lot of different areas, and it doesn't feel like that there's been any. Mm-hmm. And it's been very smooth. It's been a very, I hesitate to say easy, but like that's kind of how it's felt like. As soon as his hire was announced, as soon as we got to meet him that first Saturday, everything has more or less been smooth sailing. The staff came together, and we'll touch on that a little bit. Recruiting has taken off. I think the only other point that I wanted to make about like this hire making a lot of sense is I think a lot of people, the slam dunk hires, like as we're going through the process, it's like, yeah, you got to call Kirby and he's got to say no. You got to call Sark. He's got to say no. Right. I think it ended up being between DeBoer and Mike Norvell from Florida State. Right. And it looked like there was obvious interest from both sides. But, I think there was maybe a little bit of interest from Alabama's side on perhaps Dan Lanning, a guy that knew the program, very much built in a similar mold to Nick Saban in that he's kind of a defense first coach, but he's really figured out the offense stuff while in Eugene. I thought that hire would have made a lot of sense, and then back to the point about, where is college football heading, right? I think a lot of the NIL and the transfer portal has, and we really saw it a lot this past season, a lot of parity at the top of the sport. And so when you got a lot of teams that are very similarly built or they're very even talent wise, what separates? Good coaching, good play calling, good X's and O's, good scheme. I would argue that there's really not been a ton of people that are better at that or have been better at that on a regular basis over the last 5-6 years than a guy like Kalen DeBoer. You saw what he did at, with Indiana, the 1 year he was the offensive coordinator there. You saw what he did at Fresno State. We all saw obviously what he did at Washington. Now he's coming to Alabama. I don't know. There's a lot of things to be excited about. The transition was very smooth, very easy, and we'll see if that continues. But yeah, I thought the hire itself was very intriguing. And when I think when you take a step back and you see everything about the hire, the man, the staff he's assembled, what he's all about, and more to this too, like the player response over the last 5-6 months. Okay, like that's, if the players feel good, like I feel good, right? Like that's, normally I'm taking my cues from Saban, the first year covering the team. It's like, all right, if Saban feels good, if he's at ease, maybe I should feel pretty good too, just about the prospect of the team. Like when there's a new coach, DeBoer's always super calm, right? So, okay, what do the players think? What do some of the assistants think? Like everybody in the building feels good, it seems like, which as they should. It's the off season. Everybody feels good, but particularly with the transition and everything, I don't know. I've been impressed by how smooth everything has been.
Yeah, he's I don't know if he'd call himself a player's coach, but they respond to him. And
Yeah.
like I think about it, like what if Nick Saban was taking over a program right now without his track record and knowing how he handles things with a transfer portal, how much upheaval there would be because he's so like this is how we do things, and he's respected. Don't get me wrong, but it's a very different approach. It's a very different style that Kalen brings to it, and it could have been worse in terms of that week after Nick leaves and everybody's entering the portal and it feels like the sky's falling. I understood why people felt that in the moment, but you look back on it, like we talked about before we started recording, Washington lost every starter on offense and all but two starters on defense. Basically, their entire start like gone. Alabama didn't have to go through that, and I think that's a testament to Nick staying and helping ease that transition, but also the way players in very short order have responded to Kalen and his coaching staff. And I think you're seeing it also play out in recruiting as well. I know it's a tangential point, but they have this ability to connect that I think really resonates and is going to be useful, especially in this era of college football, where if you don't have good relationships, the exit, there's barely a door. You just walk and leave. You don't even have to pull the handle. You need to have a reason for those guys to stay, and those relationships are where it begins and ends. And this staff seems well equipped to do that.
And that transitions nicely into, when I was going about planning for this pod, I basically wrote down like all the major events, what the dates were, what the impact was, how we felt about him at the time. Literally 12 days after DeBoer's hire was announced, so January 24th, Ryan Williams, 5-star receiver from Saraland, recommits to Alabama, right? He was a one-time commit to Nick Saban, decommits after Saban retires, recommits after DeBoer gets a chunk of his staff in Tuscaloosa. They host a visit weekend. He commits. I shout out to Jalen Mbakwe, who I know played a huge role in, getting Williams back to reconsidering Alabama. And the reason I wrote this down is a big one because this was the first, 5-star receiver, in-state kid, the blue chip of the blue chips, right? Ultimately reclassified. So, but still, like if you can be a blue chip in one classification, reclassifying can still be a blue chip. Like obviously you're highly thought of. That to me was kind of a moment where it was like, oh, okay. Because I think there was, when DeBoer got hired, it's, can this guy recruit the South? Can he, accumulate enough talent to compete with Georgia and compete with Texas and compete with, Ohio State and some of these other guys? This to me was like, yes, like they can clearly get the job done because they were able to reel a kid back in, not just any kid, but a blue chip in-state guy. And like that to me was kind of okay. Like that was a moment. That was a pretty significant moment I felt in the early Kalen DeBoer tenure. Like it was literally 12 days after he was hired that they were able to, bring this guy into the fold. I thought that was pretty important.
Oh, it was huge. Not just all that. It's the nightmare scenario that he does not recommit and instead goes to Auburn. And then you got to deal with that kid for 3 or 4 years, and probably 3 as good as he is. And that would have just been a thorn in their side. Yeah, it did speak to this staff. Kalen DeBoer, Courtney Morgan, Jamarcus Shepard played a huge role in all this. But the fact that they pretty quickly got things turned around too, it's a testament to them. But also, I will say this from talking to people in the building, it's a testament to Ryan Williams and the fact that he really wants this program to succeed. Like he is their top recruiter right now in terms of players He is a guy who's out there trying to make sure that Alabama football does not fall one iota on the pecking order. Like, it means something to him. And when you say he's been on campus for a month and a half, that's true. He's also been on campus a whole heck of a lot before that. Like, we would see him all the time. And that's not a short drive from the Mobile area up to Tuscaloosa all the time. So it didn't take a ton of, I think, of basically influencing him to come back. It was more like a check in. Do we align? Do our vibes, sort of work together? And that was there immediately. And I think we'll get to this. It's pretty simple too, right? When you're Kalen DeBoer and Jamarcus Shepard, you say, watch our offense. What do you think? You see that receiver? You see that receiver? You see that receiver? Yeah, they're all going pro. They're all going to be drafted in the first 3 rounds. It's pretty appealing. And that's what's, again, if you can do it at Washington, you better be able to do it at Alabama. And you should be able to recruit in a really big way. And Ryan was the start of it. I don't know if it's the Julio Jones planting the flag like Nick Saban did, because it was so quick of a turnaround, but it wasn't far off of that. I think it really did signal to a lot of people internally, when I'm talking about Alabama fans, but a lot of people externally, that this staff is ready to compete.
And that leads into the kind of the next thing, not so much a specific date, but really through, January and into February, DeBoer was able to assemble his staff, which, and there, I guess the reason I bring this up is because it's a really good mix. And I think a huge credit to DeBoer to kind of, one, he was able to retain a couple of guys from Saban's first step, right? Freddie Roach and Robert Gillespie. And I know we've made the point here, right, that you look at all of the turnover from Alabama's last roster, right? The guys that could have stayed and ultimately left. Gillespie and Roach, right? The running back coach and the defensive line coach, none of their rooms really experienced any major turnover. I know there was a couple of, defensive linemen that ultimately left through the portal, but although like those are, and those are widely considered two of the strongest rooms, position groups, I think on the roster. We'll get to your, position group rankings here in a little bit, but that was key. He was able to bring in guys that he knew from Washington and elsewhere, right? Jamarcus Shepard, you mentioned him. Nick Sheridan's a guy that he's been with for a while. Kane Womack, when they were the coordinators of that 2019 Indiana team. Womack obviously has, some Southern ties being at South Alabama the last few years. But then he was able to bring in, some other guys who have been really crucial to a lot of their recruiting wins, guys that players have responded to, Christian Robinson bringing him in, Chris Kapilovich, the offensive line coach, who, more so from Michigan State. I know he pulled him over from Baylor, but I mean, he was really only at Baylor for like a month or something like that. He was really, the staff he was really able to assemble for a lot of different reasons, just very impressive when it comes to, their track records, their recruiting track records, their coaching track records. He was able to pull what I think it was 3 total sitting head coaches, right, to join his staff. That's impressive, right? Like that is, and it took a while, I think, for everything to fully come together, especially on the offensive side of the ball, because I think a lot of us assumed that Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff would follow him from Washington, and it looked like they did for a little while until the whole Seattle thing happened. But the staff that DeBoer ultimately brought together, through January, February, maybe even part of March as well, just really impressive. Just the personnel he was able to bring to Tuscaloosa and just surround himself with. I was really impressed by that as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's okay to say that they would be a better staff with Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff on paper. I mean, those two guys are absolute studs. There's a reason the NFL was looking at them. And it stung because it looked like they were going to go, and then it looked like they weren't. And then you had that Red Elephant Club or Tide Pride, I can't remember what event it was, where Ryan Grubb comes up to the podium and says, I'm Ryan Grubb, I'm your offensive coordinator. Everybody goes, yeah, here we are. There you go. Well, it didn't work out that way. But the good thing is that Kalen DeBoer was able to pivot very quickly and knew that I've got a young, talented guy, Nick Sheridan, that I believe in, that I can promote to coordinator, who's done it before. And not only that, I can go out and get guys who I need to, whether it's Brian Ellis or Kapilovic. And the fact that I talked to a guy at an analytics firm and told me Kapilovic was the best, highest rated Big Ten offensive line coach on paper that they had going to this, coming out of last season. So that's something that they were able to very quickly go, I'm going to go get that guy and get him. So, yes, the staff is solid. And, if you're going to lose somebody, lose them on the offensive side of the ball because you do have Kalen DeBoer, who has that track record and can be that backstop. It's a very solid staff, and I think the retention piece of it with Roach and with Gillespie is going to pay huge. It's already paying huge dividends in recruiting, and the more guys get in front of a Jamarcus Shepard, a Kane Womack, that's going to continue to do well. Shepard in particular just has one of the biggest, most attractive personalities you're going to come across in coaching. So it's a staff that seems to be coming together really well, and a staff that Kalen DeBoer has gone out of his way to say is living up to his standard, is really deserving a lot of credit for the success they've had so far. And they're really close. And I think when you're in the foxhole like they are all the time, with all the things they've got to deal with roster management and everything that comes along, it's a positive sign that for an inaugural staff, you don't look and say, oh, there's a hole, there's a hole, there's a hole. No, it's pretty solid across the board.
Another thing that happened, this was more late February, not exactly football related, but kind of football related. There was a changing of the guard, I suppose, for the Crimson Tide Sport Network. Eli Gold, more or less officially relieved of his duties. I think this was something that was kind of a long time coming. I don't know that we touched on it too much when it happened. I don't know that we need to touch on it too much here now, but Eli Gold, obviously a guy who has been around the program for a really long time. A lot of fans really appreciate his calls, even this year. And I mean, really the last few years. I don't know how many road games he did outside of the Iron Bowl when it was at Auburn. I know that was a little bit of a sticky situation as well. I'm not sure that he was ready to leave, but Alabama was kind of ready to move on to the next thing. Any thoughts on Eli Gold maybe moving along? That's one thing that I think people, you talk about, like, let's look back and remember the offseason real quick. That's one thing that might get buried a little bit and might surprise some people when, week one hits here in about 50 days.
It's going to be one of the most present changes that fans are going to deal with. I mean, it's the guy they've listened to for however many years, who never missed a game until recently. Yeah, there's a political comparison that I'm not going to make, but I will say that they tried to give him the off ramp, and he just blew past it by all reporting, everything I've heard. And if Eli thinks he can still do it, God bless him, go do it. But Chris was ready for this, and I'm a Chris Stewart fan. I've been a fan of his since I was working for the Tuscaloosa News covering Alabama baseball, and he's over there in the next booth, and I'm chatting with him between innings. He's a sharp, caring guy who really knows what he's doing, but knows what the role is and how important it is to people, and I think is going to do really well for a really long time. And, not to be too critical, but I think you put them side by side over the last 2 years, and I like what Chris Stewart's doing. I think you've seen it from him that he's ready to step into those shoes. So I'm really excited to see him be the guy every week, not just on road games, not just filling in when it's needed. Really excited for him to be in the booth full time.
Didn't get to talk to him a ton, obviously, because we were busy working during the Final Four run for Alabama men's basketball, but it was kind of a joy to watch him walk back through the media area after every game and even before some other games. And, like he's an Alabama fan, right? So like, it was kind of fun to like use him to maybe check the pulse of the fan base, right? Or at least some of the diehard fans. And, he's, a little bit younger, a little bit more personable. And, I think I agree with you. Like Eli maybe deserved to, maybe go out on his own accord, I suppose. But that's, when it comes to, Crimson Tide Sports Network and what Alabama needs to do for their radio show, kind of have to do what's best for you. So I hate that it was a sticky breakup, because the couple of moments I ever had with Eli, they were good. Obviously, he's, a wealth of institutional knowledge when it comes to Alabama, and he was there for some of the program's greatest moments, right? So bummer to see him go. At the same time, yeah, I'm alongside you. Like, that's getting to see Chris Stewart get to step into this role and really get to, flourish and watch it, make it his. I think that'll be really cool. And I think Alabama fans will come around to it pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's a fresh start all the way around, too. I mean, if you got a new coaching staff, when's a better time to do it?
During that Final Four run, I wasn't around too much because I was on the West Coast watching basketball. But you and Rodak were back here. The next thing on our offseason checklist, really, again, not another hard set date, but through March and April, a lot of spring football. which kind of the first opportunity, maybe not to see the team, but it was kind of the first opportunity, I guess, maybe to hear from the team. And, we had talked about this earlier with, when DeBoer came in and how smooth the transition was. This seemed like listening to the interviews and reading the interviews, not just of the coaches, but of the players as well. This kind of hit it home that like, okay, like this more reinforcement that like, hey, this hire's probably, or at least it seems like it's working out to this point, right? Like, what do you remember, I guess, about spring ball, or what were some of your bigger takeaways looking back now on what those couple of months were like?
Yeah, in the lead up to 8A, it was a lot about what's different, what's the same, and you learn that the fourth quarter program is still there. There are pieces of the program from Nick Saban's time there that remain, which I think are smart. But also, you start to hear from players about the change in leadership and how responsive they've been to it. Deontay Lawson spoke about it. Just the way you interact on sort of a different level. Like Nick said, and I'm not putting words in Deontay's mouth here, but like I think Caden Proctor was the one who told me it's like when you want to go see Nick Saban, you make an appointment. When you want to see Kalen DeBoer, you just knock on the door or you shoot him a text. He has Snapchat. Like we talked about this. Like there's a different accessibility there. There's and Nick earned the right. Don't get me wrong. He's the greatest coach of all time. He's so much older than all these other kids. Like there was a respect factor that went into it, and they respect Kalen DeBoer, but it's more meeting on your level. It's not oh my God, look up to Nick Saban. Please tell me. Like it's different, and I think players it's a welcome change for a lot of these guys. Now, if they go and lay an egg against Wisconsin or get trounced by Georgia, and suddenly the pressure's on, like that whole tone could change in a hurry. But there is optimism around it. There is a welcomeness to it. And then you get into A-Day and you start to see things like you start to, you see, hey, there's some depth at running back. Hey, this offensive line is a little bit better than maybe what we were hearing. And maybe there's some things that need to be proven when it's, pass rush or other things. Still a lot left to be determined because it's not just a whole new coaching staff. It's a roster that's been largely in flux too. But again, I'm going to use the term "good vibes." There were good vibes around the spring, and with so much change that's gone on, that's a really good place to be.
Yeah, and it was kind of fun to really just meet. We didn't really get to talk, I think, too much to the transfers, or at least I didn't. But a lot of the new coaches, right? Like we got to meet Jamarcus Shepard, right? And you mentioned like just his outgoing personality and how animated he can be, and like that dude is going to be a head coach someday. But we got to talk to him about how he doesn't coach receivers; he coaches takers. Like there's a little bit different there, right? When Coach Cap first showed up, he talked about having the juice squad chain, right? What did it mean to Freddie Roach and Gillespie to have some what were the promotions that DeBoer gave them with the help during the transition and whatnot. Mo Lindquist, why'd you leave a head coaching role to come, be an assistant at Alabama? Same thing with Kane Womack, right? Like you were a head coach doing a lot of really good things at South Alabama, but to hear him talk about the Power Five opportunity, that was not just Power Five but SEC opportunity, right? With the script A, like he talked about how important that was for him and what that could mean for him and his career. It was just really cool to kind of just this the whole enterprise, right? And this is, big brain, big picture type thing. It's about more than just the athlete sometimes. Like it was really cool to kind of see all these guys get new opportunities. And not only that, but hear from them, right? And this is, again, not a knock on Nick Saban. His process worked, clearly. We didn't always get to hear from the assistant coaches. So it was kind of fun to take the spring and really get to learn and get to know the new guys, right? Like, where'd you come from? Why'd you come here? What do you think about the pressure and the hype and the expectations? And, oh, by the way, all these dudes on the roster, what do you think about them, right? Like, have you, that sort of thing. Like I thought that was fun. Again, I wasn't there all spring, but some of the moments I was there, I thought that was really cool to get to hear from those guys.
Yeah, and you hit on an important point. Like Nick Saban, he was in everything, but it's hard to talk with knowledge about all 85 scholarship players. It's hard. It's hard to see everybody. So to be able to get in the weeds with a Gillespie and say, "What's happened with Richard Young? Like, what's he doing?" And him be able to say, "I'm with this guy every day. Like, I know what the work he's putting in." To get that level of detail as a reporter is really nice, and I think really important to better know the program. And there's nothing to lose as a new coaching staff. It's getting your name out there. It's going to resonate with recruits in some form or fashion. And I'm excited now that we're past the portal window, that maybe there can be a little bit more openness with talking about players. I understood it completely, but there were points where you'd ask about a position or a specific player, and they got to run through everybody in the position group just to make sure nobody feels left out and thinks they're not part of the equation. So to kind of turn that page and maybe get a little bit more detail, I'm looking forward to that. And here when camp picks up in about a month.
Kind of leads into one of the other things that, the spring transfer portal window that was, I think at the time I said it was, as we were talking to DeBoer and some other guys, they knew exactly what they wanted to go get out of the spring transfer portal. They went and got those guys. I ran the numbers. This is actually kind of interesting. A lot of the defections when Saban retired, right, were defensive backs, which makes sense, right? Defensive back coach by trade. You look at the guys that they brought in versus the guys that ultimately left, right? A lot of the, and I'm not talking about, guys like Kool-Aid or Terrion or Jalen Key, the guys that ultimately went to the NFL. I'm talking about the guys that ultimately transferred out, right? Caleb Downs gone, Christian Story, Jake Pope, or a little, Tony Mitchell, Trey Amos, Des Ricks, Antonio Kite. They lost a total of almost 1,500 snaps played from last season. That's a lot. It's a lot of snaps. A big chunk of that came from Caleb Downs, who I don't think missed a single defensive snap last year. But then you look at the guys they brought in, Damani Jackson, Deshaun Jones, Cam Howard, King Mack, Keon Sabb. They actually gained a total of 2,000 snaps. So they have more experience in the room now than they did before Saban retired. Now, you could talk about talent deficit and whatnot, but that's, they wanted experience. They went and got experience, and some of these guys like Damani Jackson and Keon Sabb, and maybe to a slightly lesser extent, King Mack, Deshaun Jones, those guys are going to play important roles in that secondary, I think, coming up this fall. And so that was, I thought the spring window was kind of another okay, these guys, they know kind of how to identify exactly what they want in the portal. Is it available? Let's go get it. And especially at that position, not just position, but the secondary specifically, that was something that they needed to go get.
Well, and they didn't reach. That's the instinct, I think, for a lot of new coaching staffs is see hole, plug hole. Just get a guy who can start right away. And they didn't do that. They thought very intentionally about getting guys who can be in the program for multiple years. And maybe they're not a starter this year, but they can provide depth and maybe be a starter next year. Perfect example of that is on the offensive line with Gino Vandemark, who I think can give you versatility on the interior offensive line, whether it's guard or center. This year, don't really project him to start, but next year that opportunity is wide open for him potentially. And that happened on the defensive side of the ball. I think it was an illusion to think they were going to go get a bunch of all-conference players. They were not available in the spring. If I ran the numbers, I think it was either 4 or 5 players, and the total 247 transfer portal player rankings. So from the end of last season until now, 4 or 5 of those guys were in the spring. That's it.
Yeah.
Most of the guys who were really good already left. So what they had to choose from was slim, but then to go get a King Mack, who does have talent and multiple years left to play, to go get a Deshaun Jones, who can be a starter, I think, at cornerback, to go get a Cam Howard, who's got multiple years of experience and multiple years remaining. They plugged the holes and they did exactly what they needed to do, which was come out with better depth and more talent than when they went in. Because it wasn't just getting all those players, it was also holding on to everybody you wanted to. They didn't lose anybody unexpectedly, really. Losing Brockermeyer was a little bit, maybe you would have liked to have kept him.
Yeah.
But you also feel good about Parker Brailsford coming back after missing the spring. So they really did the job and put themselves in a position to compete for a spot in the playoff this year, which is exactly what they needed to do.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, when the portal first opened, I think you were the ones who had mentioned, hey, if there's a big X receiver out there, if there's a guy who can play that, that Roma Dunze role, try it, right? But that market never materialized, right? I think we all kind of thought that, even with Caden Proctor coming back, hey, if there's a good offensive tackle out there, specifically one maybe with a little bit more experience at right tackle, take a flyer. Let's see if it's there. I don't know that market ever materialized in a way that they felt the need to go get it, right? Kind of to your point, they didn't reach, which I thought was, okay. So part of us is okay, maybe they feel good enough about the guys that are in the room to where they didn't feel like they needed to reach. And so that's, I feel good if you feel good coming back up again. But hey, that's, that was at least one of my thoughts.
Well, there are probably two, if I remember right, maybe two receivers that I think they kicked the tires on. And I think it's interesting because if they were in a position where I think there were fewer holes to fill, maybe they would have pushed harder. Maybe they would have spent more money in that area because that's ultimately what it comes down to a lot of these times. But I think what they did was be very intentional about, hey, it's not just, we can live with our receivers we got now. We got Ryan Williams coming in. That is basically adding a transfer who we think can play right away. And let's, spend our money and build depth in the spot where we desperately need it, which was on the offensive line and then in the defensive backfield. So yeah, they maybe would have been nice, especially in light of the Jalen Hale injury in the spring, because that really was a bitter pill to swallow. A guy who could really stretch the field, a guy who I think they thought could really contribute this coming season. But you do get Ryan Williams in the room. You do feel really good about Jeremy Bernard and the depth pieces that are there, whether it's a Kendrick Law, Kobe Prentice, and Emmanuel Henderson. Seeing where those guys develop, I think they like the talent in the room. It's just a matter of stacking the order at this point.
That was more or less, a quick 40-minute recap of Alabama's offseason. The one thing that I also wanted to get to today to kind of, begin rolling into our coverage of 2024, to touch on another story that you wrote, Alex. You basically ranked Alabama's position groups. It's on Bama 247. Go check it out. Posted it on the board. The number one group, or at least Alabama's number one group that you put at number one, was the quarterback room. Not going to hear a lot of pushback from me. I'm actually, fairly impressed that they were able to retain all of the quarterbacks from last season, right? Or at least, I guess three of them. Julian Sayin ultimately left for Ohio State, but they were able to bring in Austin Mack to kind of fill in that QB4 role. As you look at this list, right, you got inside linebacker at number 2, safety at 3. I'm not going to give away all of it because I want people to go read it. Which positions did you find maybe the hardest to, slot in or position or rank? Like, which ones were you maybe vacillating back and forth on?
The hardest part, so it's weighing talent versus production and then the depth piece. So the talent versus production piece was probably the most evident in terms of running back and defensive line. Running back, there's not a lot of, honestly, on paper, not a lot of proven anything there.
There are 0 returning starts in that running back room.
But you and I think both agree there's a lot of talent in that room.
Yes.
Justice Hayes and Jam Miller is a great 1-2 punch. Keeping Richard Young, great. And then you got
huge.
And he's a hard runner. Like, you've got a lot there that you really like. So it's like, I think I could put him anywhere between 2 and 6. Like, I really think they could be that good, but where do you rank them based on, the total number of carries, the total number of yards? And then defensive line, you're higher on the defensive line than I am. There's a lot of returning snaps there. There's a lot of size. There's a lot of depth. But I do think it's a group that has a low floor or high floor. I do think it has a low ceiling because I don't know if there's a difference maker there. I don't know if there's a guy a la Quinnen Williams, and I know those guys don't come around often, but there was a good run of them with Deron Payne, Quinnen Williams, however far back you want to go, who can not just plug up the middle, but can also create havoc and affect the quarterback. Who's going to be that guy? I didn't really see it last year very much. Ibo Igbe was a guy who every now and then you could see that from, but he's gone. So where is that going to go for them? I could make an argument for or against almost any of these groups, with the exception of probably quarterback. But those were two that really I struggled with. And then one more. I think the receivers room has a chance to be very good. But because of the inconsistencies over the last few years, because of the lack of returning production, I think I put him 7.
Yeah.
And that feels really low, but also like you've got to judge what you have on the plate. So those were a few that were really tough for me to slot in.
No, I think that makes sense. The idea of the high floor, low ceiling on the defensive line Makes a lot of sense. We've talked about that. Like, we're not sure if there's a game wrecker on that defensive line or a game altering type force, and at the same time, I think, you and I are both buying stock in the running backs. I putting the receivers, you group the receivers and tight ends together as like a pass catching group, putting them at number 7, it makes sense. I'm more curious, I think, to see like, how does DeBoer use these guys, which is maybe part of that unknown, right? Like, where do we really like Jeremy Bernard. I think you and I both really like Kobe Prentice. Not that he should be a featured guy, but he should be a guy that maybe gets more targets than he has the first couple of years. How do they use these guys, right? Like, where do they slot him in? Is Ryan Williams a guy that immediately steps up and is the dude right away, or is a dude right away? I think there's enough unknown to maybe stick them smack in the middle where you had, or at least a little bit lower. I think I could probably talk myself into putting them up a little bit higher. Offensive line at 5, I thought was really funny because I think we're all convinced that the interior is going to be really good so long as they stay healthy. And then the tackles are like, okay, like, which Caden Proctor are we going to get? Who's going to be at right tackle, right? Like, there's just, I don't know. There's enough questions that, you could probably interchange 4, 5, 6, 7. And I think it all makes sense, or at least you can make cases for. The last question I did want to have for you, you put at very last. So you ranked them 1 to 9. Number 9, you put edge. Number 8, you put cornerback. What made the difference there for you? Because cornerback, right? Like, this is just me, not super impressed with what Damani Jackson's put on tape the first couple of years. I think his transfer was a bet on the coaching staff getting the most out of his abilities because he was a 5-star prospect. Past him, like, there's just a lot of, I think, unknown. At edge, there's also a ton of unknown. What made the difference there for you putting 1 at 8 and 1 at 9?
Yeah, it was tough because I could have tied them because I have concerns about both. I think whereas the defensive line, I feel like high floor, low ceiling. It's the opposite for the cornerbacks because it's all new. Like, there's nothing returning, and you've got 2 transfers that are projected to start at this point. Damani, who we have question marks about. We know how talented he is. He's got the frame. He looks the part. And then Deshaun Jones, who have fewer question marks about, but missed all of the spring. So coming in late, how does that affect him in a new program? And then you've got all these freshmen who we feel good about. If we were doing like a 2-3 year projection, cornerback would be way up there because all the 5-star freshmen on that side of the ball. Jaleel Hurley, a redshirt freshman, we don't want to forget about. There's pieces there. But all of the newness, you just wonder how it comes together and whether there are growing pains. I think they're going to be. It's just a question of how quickly they can get over them. And then what has to concern people is it is in tandem. It's not just the cornerbacks that worry you. It's the edge rusher's ability to affect the quarterback, speed up the clock, and help those cornerbacks.
Right.
Because there's no game wrecker on that side of the ball that we're aware of. Maybe Q Robinson becomes that guy. Maybe Keanu Coate. Noah Carter, you hear good things about, but he's a young guy, like an early enrollee. Like, who's the guy? Do they have to manufacture pass rush by sending multiple guys? Well, then that leaves you exposed in terms of coverage. The edge rush, I think internally there's more optimism than externally. I'm a little concerned about those 2 groups. I could see cornerback being much higher by the end of the season, but I think it could be a rocky start because of just it's so much newness, and it's a new scheme on top of it. And it's not like the early part of the schedule is going to do them any favors because it is teams that like to throw the ball around. It is going on the road to Wisconsin. It is playing Georgia. Like, there are a lot of tests for those guys in the first 4 games.
The other thing that maybe worries me about edge a little bit, you lost a lot of talent, right? Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell, for my money, the best pass rushing duo in the country last year. But also, like, with Nick Saban's defense, you knew what they were doing, right? They were coming off the edge. They were going to collapse the pocket. They were going to beat their tackles. They were going to set the edge. Like, you knew their role. I'm very curious to see what that Wolf role looks like in Kane Womack's defense. And, there's a lot of recruiting success, right, over the last couple months about some guys like a Dawson Merritt who fits that Wolf position. How do the guys currently in the room fit that Wolf position, right? Like, there's, Yanze Pierre right behind Keanu Coate. There's Quay Rousseau, who we heard a lot last year might be the best pure pound-for-pound athlete on the team, right? Or at least up there. So, like, what does their role look like? Are they going to continue to just, come in off the edge and beat their tackle and collapse the pocket? Are they going to continue to set the edge? Kane Wommack's defense, if you go look at it, sometimes they're asked to drop back into coverage. And Dallas Turner was the rare bird that felt really, really good about doing that, or at least maybe you felt good watching him do that, right? A little bit more Donta Hightower than Will Anderson. I think that was the comparison that Nick Saban made during the NFL draft. So what's going to be asked of these guys? Are they going to be able to do it, or will some of them go the Keon Keeley route where maybe they bulk up a little bit and drop into that banded defensive end role? I don't know. I think there are a lot more questions regarding the edge position, just, one, personnel wise, and then two, what's going to be asked of them than maybe the cornerbacks. So, I don't disagree with you putting the cornerback second to last and the edge last, but I was curious how you ultimately came to that. And it seems like we're on the same page, just maybe different routes to get there.
Yeah, and I do think, speaking of different routes to get there, I think manufacturing the pass rush, especially early, look for Devontae Smith, Red Morgan out of that Husky position. I think they're going to have to send those guys quite a bit just to get to throw some different looks. And the good news is this 4-2-5 defense does lend itself to exotic looks and bring pressures from without necessarily bringing numbers. It's going to test Womack. I really do believe in this defense long term. It's just the offense side of the ball, the personnel is much closer to where it needs to be than the defense, just because of all the youth and all the turnover on that side. And again, when Nick Saban leaves, that is to be expected. It's not necessarily a surprise, but it doesn't mean it's not a concern.
100%. We will be diving into more of these position groups conversations as the month unfolds, right, to get you ready for fall camp, which will begin at the end of the month. That's all we've got for today's show. We'll be back probably later this week to more or less preview SEC Media Days. We got a little bit more talking season to get through before we really start to get into the nitty-gritty of the X's and O's to get ready for fall camp. I'm excited for it. Like I said at the top of the show, I'm kind of sick and tired of talking season. I'm ready to finally watch some ball, or at least talk a little bit more some ball. And we're getting closer. We're getting closer. By the next time we talk, we'll be 50 days away from week 1. So each passing day, we're getting closer and closer, and I am super excited. Alex, I appreciate you joining me. In the meantime, before the next show, be sure to rate and review wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 247 Sports. Believe we are still running 2 July specials. $1 for the month of July, which, as we mentioned, includes your usual team coverage, SEC Media Days, fall camp previews. And you can also do a 50% annual off your VIP membership, which is a year's worth of Bama 247 and 247 sports coverage for all less than $5. You guys should absolutely cash in on one of those deals. Again, thank you, Alex, for joining me today. We will talk to you guys again later this week. Appreciate y'all listening.